Welcome to Asian Times TV, a direct link to the Asia Pacific region, a program where we look at the new ideas at the cutting edge of what the State Department has called America's Pacific Century. Today, we're going to look at a specialized research topic, a linkage between schooling and mothering. We have with us very special guests who've looked at schooling around the globe in many different cultures. We know that women's schooling is strongly related to child survival and other outcomes beneficial to children's health throughout the developing world, but the reasons behind these statistical correlations have not been very transparent or clear. In literacy and mothering, the authors show for the first time how communicative changes play a key role in children's development. Girls acquire academic literacy skills even in low-quality schools, which enable them as mothers to understand public health messages in the mass media and to navigate bureaucratic health services effectively, reducing risks to their children's health. With the acquisition of academic literacy, their health literacy and health navigation skills are enhanced, thereby reducing risks to children and altering interactions between mother and child. Assessment of these maternal skills in 4 diverse countries, Mexico, Nepal, Venezuela, and Zambia, support this research model that we're going to explore today. So we have with us today Professor LeVine, who is the chair, Larson Chair of Education, Human Development, and Anthropology at Harvard University, who taught me anthropology actually many, many years ago. So I'm very happy and thankful for him to join us today from Maine. He's joining us by Skype, along with Sarah LeVine, who's also a professor of anthropology at Harvard University. Both of them have written, numerous books that I couldn't even cover here today, but just let me briefly mention some of the recent books that they've worked on. Anthropology and Child Development, a cross-cultural reader, came out in 2008. Childcare and Culture, Lessons from Africa. And then Professor LeVine also received a distinguished award from AERA, which is the American Education Research Association, just recently. And then Sarah LeVine has written many books as well. One of them looking at women and social change in urban Mexico, and that was in early 90s, and then Saints of Kathmandu in 2008. So welcome, Bob and Sarah LeVine. I'm so happy to have you guys on Asian Times TV, which is part of Princeton TV. So the floor is yours.
Good to be here.
Excellent,
Well,
excellent.
Yes, and I think that one thing we might start with is the fact that South Asia is one of the places where which has a significant number of girls who never go to school.
Mm-hmm.
In Africa, it may be somewhat bigger, but it's amazing that how many girls there are in South Asia who don't go to school at all, even in India.
Mm-hmm. So one of the questions we start off with is, the role of anthropology in international development, in schooling, through development agencies. What is that? What is that critical function that cultural anthropologists provide around the world?
Well, international development agencies have been typically run by people who are more or less economists. So anthropologists have played a very small role. I won't say it was negligible, but most of the time they've been doing things like land tenure issues and other issues that are not directly related to education. So I would say our research group is the only one that's paid a great deal of attention to it within the anthropology of development.
Fantastic, fantastic. Yeah. So, I looked into this kind of interface between anthropology and education and maternal schooling a little bit when I was writing about President Obama's mother. And Dunham, we have a president for the first time whose mother was an anthropologist and actually did work on women's schooling in Indonesia and other parts of the world. Would you comment on that on this show, given you're a trained anthropologist for many, many years and worked on a similar kind of topic and issues somewhat?
Yeah, well, it's an
Well, she was
amazing thing.
interested in the economic development of women, and that's really what she worked on.
That's true, but she was a mother.
Oh, she certainly was a mother.
Right,
Uh,
right. And yeah, I mean, some of the documentation that I acquired from Alice Dewey at Hawaii
yes.
talked about how she was teaching and doing some of the early kind of research and preparing sort of curriculum for women, young women as well as older women, in Java, Yogyakarta, and other parts of Indonesia, as project work. Not necessarily her dissertation topic, obviously, but so I thought it was an interesting connection there that I should mention in terms
Oh,
of this program.
it's very exciting.
Yeah.
So specifically, the research that you've done for the last 30 years, right? We're talking about the 4 countries you mentioned here, but of course, you've also worked in India, I think, as a
I did, yes.
Sarah has.
Sarah has, right? And you've also worked in other parts of sub-Saharan Africa for many years.
Right.
Um, so women's schooling has made inroads in some aspects of economic policy. Would you say?
Yes. After the World Bank published their famous report in 1980 that showed that education has all kinds of good positive effects, both on health, mortality, fertility, and even agricultural production, the whole world of international development policy shifted toward education, and including women's education, not exclusively women, but it shifted from a sort of ambivalent attitude about whether schools were really good for development to a uniformly positive attitude. Now, that was more than 30 years ago. So a lot of things have happened since then, including, in Indonesia, you mentioned, and Ann Dunham's role there a long time ago. Indonesia has come up hugely in terms of women's schooling, and so is almost every part of the world. But the problem areas are either areas like Africa, where the population has outpaced the expansion of schools, or places like India, where there are other aspects. Social stratification seems to play a major role in keeping girls out of school. But I just want to say, and Sarah will say more about this, India is now fully committed in a way that they were not 20 years ago.
I see. So Sarah, comment on that. I think you were doing work in Uttar Pradesh and also in South India, or?
It was Andhra.
Andhra Pradesh, okay.
Yes, I was working on a project with an Indian psychologist, and the project was it was called, very grandly perhaps, it was called The Girl Child in India.
Okay.
And it was an evaluation of a government program to encourage the poorest of the poor, who were known as what they called scheduled castes, that is, the people at the bottom of the caste system. It was an attempt to encourage parents to send their daughters to school. And they did this by the government. It didn't happen everywhere in India, but in certain rather progressive states it was adopted. And the government paid parents a certain amount of money to send their daughters to school and to keep them in school. The idea being that that if you kept your daughter in school and she finished the 10th grade, which is the end of high school in India, then she would be an economic asset to the parents, which was a very new idea to poor people. They had always thought of only their sons as being economic assets, because when girls got married, they moved out to their husbands' homes.
Right.
Anyway, it was really an astonishing experience for me to see how these very poor people were sending their daughters to school. In our sample, which was pretty large, we didn't have a single mother who had ever set foot in a school.
I see.
Very few fathers, but the daughters were all going. And the idea was, we heard it again and again, if we don't have sons, then our daughters will be like sons, and they will take care of us in our old age because they will be educated. So it was rather thrilling for me to work there.
Fantastic, fantastic. It's a great study. So, but that's not published here, right? It's published elsewhere as part of the.
Yes, it's published elsewhere. My colleague is a professor at the University of Hong Kong.
I see.
Pramila Rao.
Okay. So now moving on to your study, which covers Africa, Asia, Latin America, South America, you focus extensively on maternal literacy, and you test out the model, looking at maternal literacy and how it improves various childhood outcomes, and you find that this is a robust finding around the world. So share that finding with us.
Yes, let me just correct that. The demographers have found over and over again that it's a very robust finding. It's possibly the most robust finding in comparative social surveys.
Okay.
It's just been replicated everywhere using the demographic and health surveys, the World Fertility Survey. I could give you a long list of studies that have shown over and over again that if you want a predictor, independent of income, and husband's education, a powerful predictor of decline in child mortality and a whole bunch of other things, it's women's schooling. The school attainment of the mother, in the latest study published in the Lancet the year before last, shows that every year of additional schooling for the mother reduces child mortality by almost 10%. Every additional year of women's schooling. That's a phenomenal finding.
Right.
And actually, it's consistent with all the rest of the literature of the last 30 years.
Okay.
And so what we were interested in is trying to understand why literacy has such an effect. I mean, we know it has an effect, but we didn't understand what was involved. What is it about literacy that reduces infant mortality?
Well, what is it about schooling, first of all? Right. And we say it's literacy and language skills.
I see. Okay. So you unpack the variable in some ways, right? As Michael Cole talks about it.
We unpack the black box.
Right. So what are the various components inside the box as you have unpacked it?
Yeah. Well, there's reading comprehension. That is the part that, from what you said at the outset, is related to media, the ability to connect well with the media. So we give them reading comprehension tests.
And I just want to say something.
Sure.
When we started out on this study, we didn't know, Bob and I didn't know much about literacy at all. So we learned from our graduate students. And one of the things, the first thing we learned was that there was a radical difference between reading, being able to read, which is what we learned with literacy specialists called decoding, and comprehension. In other words, in many languages which are completely phonetic, they're written phonetically, you can read very well, but that doesn't mean to say that you understand what you're reading.
Right.
And so we realized that comprehension was essential.
It's key. And we fortunately had, wonderful colleagues.
Right. Can I just say their names? Because they're a long list of colleagues who worked with you, and I know most of them. Beatrice Schnell, Anzola, Meredith Rowe, and Emily Dexter. Again, I'm holding up the book again. And the cover of the book, which shows a picture of a mother and daughter and a child in Nepal, in Kathmandu, where Sarah, I know, did the groundwork there when I was there. I actually visited with her. So I remember that picture quite, memorably. So you've unpacked the variable. You find that literacy, there's a health literacy component, media literacy component, as well as some bureaucratic knowledge that mothers acquire.
But the ability to use academic language, or that is more abstract language. And we have a test of that. That comes from Catherine Snow, who, by the way, our colleague who was our co-authors are all students of Catherine Snow.
Right.
They also learned about reading comprehension from Jean Chal, who was also teaching at the Ed School then.
Right.
Yeah, so we have, in addition to reading comprehension, we tested them all for their ability to use abstract nouns.
And the point about that is that when they grew up, when girls who've been to school grow up and become mothers, they have to deal with two kinds of bureaucrats. First of all, their children's teachers, and even before that, healthcare people, that is nurses and doctors. And we discovered something which I suppose is fairly obvious, but if a mother can't tell a comprehensive narrative, can't tell a story about what is wrong with her child or with herself when she goes to a clinic, then the person she's talking to, that is the healthcare provider, will either just sort of pay no attention or get the story wrong. And that is extremely important. That, in other words, when girls have gone to school, the more they've been to school, the better they are able to tell a comprehensive story about what has happened when the children are sick.
And we tested that. We got all the mothers in the 4 countries to give an illness narrative in which they had to tell a story, and then we coded those things for.
But there are 2 things about telling the story. First of all, the language that mothers use. If it sounds like sort of rural hicks, then the healthcare provider is going to dismiss them as a rural hick. That's the first thing. The second thing is the ability to tell a comprehensive story.
The organization.
The organization of the information that they're giving. And children who have never been to school, who have never had anybody read to them, who have never had, through learning to read themselves, have never acquired the ability to read an organized narrative and incorporate the form of a narrative. When they grow up, they're not able to tell a story. And I was astonished by this because we first discovered this in Mexico. That is, we first were informed by our students and by our colleagues that this might be the case. I was working with Mexican mothers who were extremely voluble, and they talked at a great rate, and yet very often, though my Spanish was very good, I couldn't understand what their point was. And I thought it was because they were not willing to tell me the truth, perhaps. But because of the work we did, or shall we say, the education that we received from our colleagues and our graduate students, we came to understand that the reason these women weren't telling a straight story was because they had no experience of telling a straight story.
I see.
Consider a straight story, which is, a clear-cut sequence of events.
And a narrative. So what is the role of culture in all of this, Bob? Culture?
Yeah.
Speak about that.
I don't think I've left out culture. The culture is the culture of the school, which is a Western culture.
Okay.
And what we've shown is that the fact that the use of abstraction, which is so prominent in schools, that comes right from the Aristotelian way of teaching that is embedded in all Western schools. And it's not true of schools, indigenous Eastern schools like Gurukula in India, or the Quranic schools in the Middle East, and so on. It's quite different.
I see.
The Aristotelian school is still what what has been taken up as part of international development.
I see. So, but you also tease out certain alternative hypotheses in the book. So you look at, for instance, SES. Why isn't it economic mobility, for instance, that may account for the same dynamic? And you argue that it's not economic mobility, that it's really literacy.
No. Let me just emphasize that we don't say there is no effect of urbanization
Okay.
or income. Those things have a huge effect too.
Okay.
But those are things that are much less easy to change. If you're talking about policy issues, so of course, if you raise everybody's income, they're going to have better health care. If you move them all from remote or rural areas into the city, they're going to do better in terms of health. But sending girls to school has an independent effect. When you control for all the other things,
Okay.
statistically, you still find a huge impact of women's schooling.
And is there certain innate ability in terms of certain mothers being more facile with language and more, quick in terms of just having an ability to deal with bureaucrats and social relationships much more, quickly in a facile way to be able to protect their kids? Is there certain?
I'll tell you why the data don't support that. Not
Okay.
our data, once again,
Sure.
but going back to that wonderful article in The Lancet, which is the best study that's ever been done, 2010, they show that if you look at the increase in average women's school attainment between 1990 and 2009, and then you look at as the outcome variable the decrease in child mortality over the same period of basically the last 20 years, you find that the increase in women's schooling actually accounts for almost half of the decrease in child mortality, under 5 child mortality, and that can't be due to innate factors,
Okay.
because it's about the change over time of these things.
And then what about motivation? Because that's another thing you
Yes.
look at. Certain mothers would be motivated due to certain, let's say, household factors or a certain kind of parental socialization they may have received.
Well, first of all, we certainly know that there is an effect of whether their parents were educated or not. It operates in the same direction, so we control for that statistically,
Okay.
in order to see what the effect of the mother's own education is. But I lost the track there. There was something.
Yes, you were saying about the transmission from the mother to then the new mother who kind of, let's say, raises her own kids, gets more than primary education or more than primary education. Right? There is that differentiation as well in terms of primary versus secondary.
Better. It keeps on getting better as you get more years of schooling.
Okay.
About the other factors that might account for it. What was
controlled statistically?
Yeah.
Motivation, genetics,
Motivation.
economic.
Motivation has been the favorite speculation by demographers. They say, oh yes, women's education is like it's an empowerment. They feel empowered. They're more autonomous, and all those sorts of things. And what anthropologists have actually shown, a case in autonomy, particularly in India, is that it doesn't always work. So what my argument is, that our argument is that the motivational factors that have been speculated about, especially relating to empowerment or the feeling of empowerment, happen in some cohorts at some particular points in the educational history, but not nearly enough to explain the uniformity of the effect. In other words, what we saw in Mexico, we saw that the earliest, the women who were the first ones to get educated, they were really felt empowered. But by the time we got to Mexico, the average girl was getting 9 years of schooling already. And they didn't particularly feel empowered. They were just doing what everybody else was doing. So even within a country, you can't assume that empowerment is something that women get from education. It happens in some places and sometimes, but not always.
I see.
But the effect is something that happens everywhere, it seems, all the time.
So what are the policy implications of this research? Should development agencies be spending more resources than targeting literacy programs? Can you speak about that?
Yes. The whole question of whether they should have adult literacy programs is still very debatable, and it is debated. I mean,
want to say something about
yeah,
that. In Nepal, where nobody went to school, boys or girls, hardly anybody had the opportunity to go to school before 1951. In the rural area where we worked in the village, which you unfortunately didn't have a chance to see, but you only saw the city. But in the village, the vast majority of women mothers of young children had not been to school. However, they had adult literacy classes, and they'd had them for some years. And a lot of women had attended these classes. However, we tested them, and it appeared that literally none of them had learned how. Some of them could decode a little bit, but they hadn't learned they couldn't comprehend what they read.
I see.
And the reason for that was because these women, and this is true of many peasant societies, the women are out working in the fields all day.
They work so hard.
So hard. And then these literacy classes are, after they've fulfilled all their obligations. The classes are taught from 7 o'clock in the evening till 9 or 10, by which time the women are falling asleep. And they might be highly motivated to go to the class, but they don't really learn anything. And one of the reasons that they're motivated to go to the class is that it gives them a little time off and they get to see their friends. And my experience, talking to these women, is that it was like going to a club for them. But that didn't mean to say they learned anything. So I think that at least when I was doing my work in Nepal, which now is, 14, 15 years ago, it was a long time ago, it was sort of generally agreed that it's ever so much more economic to send girls to school when they're young.
Yeah.
Have 6 hours in the day.
So we have 1 more minute left, Bob. So President Obama just appointed a medical anthropologist to head up the World Bank.
Yes, and we know him, Jim Kim. Yeah.
So what do you think? Do you think culture is going to come more front and center now in terms of policy making at the World Bank, especially on issues of literacy?
It has a real chance of happening. Yeah, I think it's a great thing because Jim Kim is a wise man with incredible skill.
And the president of Dartmouth, right? Or I think he was. Or?
He's been the president of Dartmouth the last 3 years, and I think it just is something so different from the World Bank's normal orientation. But he understands development extremely well, and I'm looking forward to something new coming out of the World Bank. Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us, Bob and Sarah. I really appreciate this time with you after many years. So here's the book, Literacy and Mothering by Oxford University Press. You have to go out and buy it. It's a great book. It's 30 years, almost 40 years of research packed into, as Bob can only do, into 300 pages. Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Sarah. Talk to you soon.